Welcome to the inner sanctum of the audiobook empire. The person who talks the most in the room is not the most powerful, they are the most anxious. Real power sits in calculated silence and speaks only once, and that single truth alone is enough to redraw the map of every professional relationship you have built until today. 95% of people negotiate in a way that makes the other party win automatically, not because they are weak, but because they do not realize they started losing before they ever opened their mouths. And what is more dangerous than the loss itself is the false sense of security that accompanies it. If you need other people's approval to validate your decisions, you have not built an identity yet. You have built a dependency. The person you think is confident in your circle most likely does not possess confidence at all. They possess trained indifference, engineered with precision and deliberate practice. The difference between the two does not reveal itself in ordinary moments. It reveals itself the instant pressure is applied and everything collapses within seconds. There is one sentence, if spoken at the beginning of any negotiation, that makes the other party feel they are in control, while you are the one orchestrating everything from behind an invisible curtain. This sentence is not magic. It's linguistic engineering built on a deep understanding of how the brain functions under the pressure of decision. And the book you are about to hear today is not taught in MBA programs for one reason only, because it explains how the game works from the inside, in a language never designed for the general public. This content is not for those seeking morning motivation that evaporates before noon. This is for those who have made a final, irreversible decision to understand how social dominance is built scientifically and systematically, far beyond empty slogans and packaged advice. If you are comfortable in your life right now and feel no internal friction whatsoever, close this video. But if you feel there is another level you have not yet reached, a level seen by few and lived by even fewer, continue, because what follows was engineered for you alone. Every single day you pass without understanding these rules, someone else is understanding them and applying them to you in complete silence. This is not a theoretical assumption, and it's not rhetorical exaggeration. This is what is happening right now, in every boardroom, at every negotiation table, and in every relationship where one party believes the dynamic is equal. The money you didn't earn this month didn't vanish into thin air. It went to someone who knows one rule you do not know yet, and it will keep going to them for as long as this cognitive gap remains open. Demonstration of the vulnerability it describes. The belief that intelligence, education, professional experience, and analytical sophistication constitute a natural immunity against psychological manipulation. That the kind of person who reads extensively, thinks critically, and operates with deliberate strategic awareness in their professional environment is categorically different from the kind of person who falls prey to the influence operations, emotional exploitation, and systematic cognitive contamination that manipulation produces. That psychological manipulation is something that happens to other people, less sophisticated people, less aware people, people who have not developed the analytical capabilities that professional excellence demands. This belief is not merely wrong, it is precisely the belief that the most skilled manipulators in every professional environment actively cultivate in their targets, because a target who believes they are immune to manipulation is a target who has disabled the vigilance systems that detection requires, and a target with disabled vigilance systems is the easiest target of all. The empirical literature on psychological influence and social manipulation is unambiguous on this point, and its unambiguity is uncomfortable in ways that professional culture consistently resists acknowledging. Intelligence does not protect against manipulation. In many specific and well-documented ways, it makes certain forms of manipulation more effective rather than less. The intelligent person's capacity for sophisticated reasoning does not merely evaluate information more accurately than a less sophisticated reasoner, it also constructs more elaborate and more internally coherent rationalizations for conclusions that have been reached through manipulative influence rather than genuine analytical process, producing a higher quality defense of a compromised position that is correspondingly more resistant to correction through external challenge. The analytically sophisticated professional who has been manipulated into a position does not merely hold that position, they defend it with the full force of their analytical capabilities, constructing arguments for it that they themselves find genuinely compelling, and that external observers find difficult to challenge precisely because of the quality of reasoning that the sophisticated mind has applied to the task of defending a conclusion that was not, at its origin, analytically derived. The art of mental shielding begins from this uncomfortable premise and builds from it a framework that is neither pessimistic about the possibility of genuine protection against manipulation, nor naively optimistic about the ease with which that protection can be achieved. The framework's foundational recognition is that psychological protection against manipulation is not a natural endowment that some people possess and others lack. It is a developed capability that requires the same systematic, disciplined, technically precise development that any other sophisticated professional skill requires, and that its development begins with the honest acknowledgement that the absence of that development leaves every professional, regardless of their intelligence or sophistication, genuinely vulnerable to the forms of psychological manipulation that the professional environments they operate in consistently generate. The first component of this honest acknowledgement is the recognition of what manipulation actually is at the level of its operational mechanism, not the crude, obvious influence attempts that analytical sophistication can detect and dismiss, but the subtle, sophisticated, patient operations that work precisely because they are invisible to the vigilant systems that obvious manipulation triggers. Sophisticated manipulation does not present as manipulation. It presents as genuine relationship, as authentic concern, as reasonable professional guidance, as the natural evolution of a productive working dynamic. And it produces its effects not through the dramatic, detectable influence attempts that self-defense training typically addresses, but through the slow, systematic, incremental shifting of the target's perceptual framework, emotional baseline, and decision-making architecture in directions that serve the manipulator's interests while remaining entirely below the threshold of the target's conscious detection. The professional who enters these environments without a developed mental shielding capability is not entering a neutral professional landscape where their merit and capability will be evaluated on their objective merits. They are entering a psychological influence environment where the dynamics of power, perception management, and cognitive contamination are as consequential as any substantive professional capability they bring, and where the absence of a developed shielding framework leaves them operating at a structural disadvantage that no amount of technical expertise or strategic knowledge can compensate for. The mental shield is not built from suspicion. It is not built from cynicism, from the assumption that every professional relationship is a manipulation waiting to be detected, or from the defensive withdrawal that paranoia produces. It is built from clarity, the specific, developed, technically precise clarity of perception that allows the professional to see the actual dynamics of their professional environment. Accurately, to distinguish genuine relational engagement from strategic influence operations, and to maintain the cognitive sovereignty that accurate perception requires in environments specifically designed to compromise it. There is a taxonomy of psychological manipulation that operates in professional environments with sufficient consistency across cultures, industries, and organizational contexts that its patterns can be mapped with the same precision that any other behavioral phenomenon of comparable reliability can be documented. A taxonomy whose mastery does not produce paranoia or the corrosive suspicion that sees manipulation in every professional interaction, but rather the discriminative clarity that allows genuine relationship to be distinguished from strategic exploitation with sufficient accuracy to make the distinction actionable in real time. The six primary patterns that constitute this taxonomy are not arbitrary categories. They are the empirically recurring configurations of manipulative behavior that the psychological literature on influence, coercion, and social exploitation has consistently identified across the full range of professional and organizational contexts where systematic psychological manipulation has been studied with sufficient rigor to produce reliable descriptive frameworks. Each pattern has its own operational mechanism, its own characteristic target selection process, its own specific vulnerability profile among the professional populations it most effectively exploits, and its own distinctive early warning signals, whose recognition is the foundational requirement for the mental shielding response that effective protection demands. The first pattern is reality distortion, the systematic manipulation of the target's perception of factual events, interpersonal dynamics, and causal relationships to produce a version of reality that serves the manipulator's strategic interests while progressively undermining the target's own confidence in their own perceptual and judgmental capabilities. Reality distortion is the operational core of what popular psychology has labeled gaslighting, a term whose widespread adoption has paradoxically reduced its practical utility by making it so broadly applied that it has lost the precision needed to identify the specific behavioral patterns that constitute its professional expression. In its sophisticated professional manifestation, reality distortion does not involve the obvious denial of clearly established facts that the popular conception of gaslighting typically describes. It operates instead through the subtle, patient, systematic reframing of ambiguous events. The meeting that the target remembers as producing a specific agreement is characterized by the manipulator as having produced a fundamentally different one. The performance evaluation that the target experienced as positive is retrospectively described as having contained significant concerns that the target apparently failed to register. The interpersonal dynamic that the target perceived as collegial is characterized as having been strained in ways that the target's perceptual limitations apparently prevented them from detecting. The second pattern is emotional leverage, the systematic identification and exploitation of the target's emotional needs, vulnerabilities, and attachment patterns to create psychological dependencies that give the manipulator disproportionate influence over the target's decisions, behaviors, and perceptions. Emotional leverage operates through a two-phase sequence that the psychological literature on coercive control has documented with considerable precision. The first phase is idealization, the deliberate provision of unusually high levels of the specific emotional experience that the target's vulnerability profile identifies as most psychologically significant, creating a powerful positive emotional bond whose maintenance becomes a primary motivational force in the target's subsequent behavior. The second phase is conditional withdrawal, the strategic reduction of the idealized experience to create the anxiety of potential loss that makes the target's continued access to the experience contingent on behaviors and compliance that serve the manipulator's interests. In professional contexts, emotional leverage most commonly operates through the manipulation of recognition, belonging, and professional validation, the three emotional currencies whose supply is most easily controlled by actors with organizational authority and whose withdrawal most reliably produces the compliance-seeking behavior that the manipulator's strategy requires. The third pattern is information control, the strategic management of what information the target has access to, what information is withheld from them, how available information is framed and contextualized, and what the target's information environment communicates about their own standing, capability, and value within the professional system they operate in. Information control is perhaps the most structurally embedded of the 6 patterns in legitimate organizational hierarchies, because the differential distribution of information is a natural feature of any complex organization. Its manipulation is consistently easier to conceal within the normal functioning of organizational information flows than any of the other 5 patterns. The manipulator who controls the target's information environment does not need to deploy obvious deception. They need only to manage the selection, sequencing, and framing of the information that reaches the target through apparently legitimate organizational channels to produce the perceptual distortions and decision errors that serve their strategic interests. The fourth pattern is progressive exhaustion, the systematic deployment of cognitive, emotional, and physical demands that gradually deplete the target's psychological resources to the point where their capacity for independent judgment, critical evaluation, and resistance to influence is significantly compromised. Progressive exhaustion is the most patient of the 6 patterns, and the one whose effects are most consistently misattributed by its targets to external environmental pressures rather than to deliberate manipulation, because the exhaustion it produces is real. The demands it deploys are individually justifiable, and the cumulative effect of those demands on the target's decision-making capacity is invisible to a target whose depleted cognitive resources are insufficient to detect the pattern that is depleting them. The fifth pattern is social isolation, the systematic reduction of the target's access to the independent perspectives, alternative information sources, and relational support networks that would provide the external reality checks needed to detect and correct the distortions that the other manipulation patterns are producing. Social isolation in professional contexts does not require the physical separation that its most extreme manifestations involve. It requires only the progressive delegitimization of the relationships and information sources that could provide independent perspective, accomplished through the patient cultivation of the target's distrust of alternative voices and their corresponding dependence on the manipulator as their primary relational and informational reference point. The fifth pattern is identity erosion, the most sophisticated and most damaging of the 6 patterns, operating through the systematic undermining of the target's sense of who they are, what they value, what they are capable of, and what they deserve, replacing the target's authentic self-conception with an identity constructed by the manipulator that is more amenable to the compliance, dependence, and behavioral patterns that the manipulator's strategy requires. Identity erosion is rarely deployed as a primary manipulation strategy in isolation. It is most commonly the cumulative product of the other 5 patterns operating simultaneously over extended periods, each contributing to the progressive destabilization of the target's psychological foundation that identity erosion represents in its fully developed form. These 6 patterns do not operate in isolation. They combine, reinforce each other, and escalate in intensity as the manipulator's confidence in the target's vulnerability increases, producing the characteristic trajectory of sophisticated professional manipulation that moves from subtle initial probing through progressive entrenchment to the systematic exploitation of a target whose mental shielding capability has been insufficient to detect and interrupt the pattern before it reached its most damaging phase. There is a specific form of psychological disorientation that is uniquely devastating in its effects on professional performance, decision quality, and cognitive sovereignty, a disorientation that does not arise from insufficient information, from analytical error, or from the ordinary cognitive biases that behavioral science has documented. With such thoroughness, It arises from something categorically different, from the deliberate, systematic, patient contamination of the target's perceptual framework by an actor who understands that the most effective way to control another person's behavior is not to constrain their choices directly, but to corrupt the perceptual and interpretive processes through which they evaluate their choices, construct their understanding of their situation, and assess the reliability of their own judgment. This is reality distortion in its professional manifestation, and its forensic analysis requires a level of precision that popular discussions of gaslighting rarely achieve, because the professional environments where it is most consequentially deployed are environments where its practitioners are sophisticated enough to execute it through mechanisms whose individual components are each deniable, defensible, and indistinguishable from legitimate professional communication when examined in isolation from the cumulative pattern they collectively constitute. The operational mechanism of reality distortion in professional contexts begins with what might be called the ambiguity exploitation phase, the deliberate targeting of situations, communications, and interpersonal dynamics that contain sufficient inherent ambiguity to support multiple plausible interpretations, and the systematic deployment of the interpretation that serves the manipulator's interests, while simultaneously undermining the target's confidence in their own interpretive judgment. Professional communication is inherently ambiguous in ways that make this exploitation structurally straightforward, the meeting that produces a verbal agreement without written documentation, the performance feedback that mixes positive and developmental observations in proportions that are genuinely open to interpretive variation, the interpersonal dynamic whose emotional tone is subtle enough to support different readings, the strategic direction whose implementation parameters are sufficiently unspecified to accommodate multiple approaches. Each of these ambiguous situations provides the manipulator with the raw material for reality distortion, the space between the target's interpretation and an alternative interpretation that the manipulator can occupy and expand through the patient, consistent deployment of the alternative reading as the authoritative one. The second phase is what the psychological literature on coercive control calls the credibility undermining sequence, the systematic erosion of the target's confidence in the reliability of their own perceptions and memories through a pattern of challenges, corrections, and alternative characterizations that are individually minor enough to be dismissed as misunderstandings, but that accumulate over time into a comprehensive assault on the target's trust in their own cognitive reliability. The target who has been subjected to this sequence for a sufficient period begins to experience what clinical psychologists have termed epistemic self-doubt, a generalized uncertainty of the trustworthiness of their own perceptions and memories that functions as a cognitive vulnerability of the first order, making them progressively more dependent on external verification of their own experience, and correspondingly more susceptible to the manipulator's provision of that verification in forms that serve the manipulator's interests. The professional signature of reality distortion is a specific and recognizable pattern of interaction dynamics whose individual components appear unremarkable when examined in isolation, but whose cumulative configuration points unmistakably to the deliberate deployment of reality distortion as a manipulation strategy. The first component is the consistent pattern of retrospective recharacterization, the regular occurrence of situations in which the target's memory of an event, agreement, or communication is challenged or reframed by the manipulator in ways that systematically favor the manipulator's interests. The second component is the attribution asymmetry, the consistent pattern in which the target's positive outcomes are attributed to the manipulator's guidance, support, or intervention, while the target's difficulties and failures are attributed to the target's own limitations, errors, or perceptual distortions. The third component is the witness management dynamic, the systematic arrangement of significant interactions in contexts where independent witnesses are absent,
combined with the deliberate cultivation of the manipulator's credibility with the organizational actors who might otherwise serve as alternative reality references for the target. The cognitive vulnerabilities that reality distortion most effectively exploits are not the vulnerabilities of the naive or the unsophisticated. They are the vulnerabilities that professional excellence itself cultivates. The high-performing professional's commitment to accuracy and self-correction makes them susceptible to the manipulator's challenges to their perceptions, because genuine intellectual honesty includes the acknowledgement that one's perceptions and memories are fallible. Their professional respect for authority and expertise makes them susceptible to the manipulator's deployment of their positional authority as the basis for their alternative characterization of events. Their investment in the professional relationship makes them susceptible to the manipulator's implicit or explicit communication that the target's insistence on their own perception of events is damaging to the relationship's productive functioning. Each of these professional virtues becomes a vector of vulnerability when deployed against a target by a reality distortion practitioner who understands their leverage potential. The early warning signals of reality distortion are detectable before the credibility undermining sequence has progressed to the point of producing significant epistemic self-doubt. But their detection requires the specific kind of pattern awareness that mental shielding training develops, because the individual signals are consistently below the threshold that would trigger alarm in a professional operating without that training. The first signal is the experience of consistent interpretive disagreement.
With a specific individual across multiple contexts and topics, disagreements that consistently favor the other party's interests and that consistently position the target's interpretation as the less reliable one. The second signal is the progressive accumulation of situations in which the target finds themselves apologizing for, retracting, or qualifying perceptions and judgments that they held with genuine confidence at the time they formed them. The third signal is the development of a specific pattern of pre-communication anxiety, the experience of reviewing one's own perceptions and memories before interacting with a specific individual to verify their accuracy in anticipation of challenge, a cognitive behavior that has no precedent in the target's interactions with other professional counterparts. The mental shielding response to detected reality distortion begins with the establishment of an independent documentary record, the systematic, contemporaneous documentation of significant interactions, agreements, and communications that provides an objective reference point whose existence is independent of both the target's memory and the manipulator's retrospective characterization. This documentation does not need to be confrontational or accusatory in its framing. It is most effectively maintained as a routine professional practice of interaction logging that provides the evidentiary foundation for the target's perceptual reliability without signaling to the manipulator that their pattern has been detected and a defensive response has been initiated. Reality distortion loses its power the moment its target stops relying exclusively on their unaided memory as the sole evidence of their own experience. The record is the shield, and the professional who maintains it consistently has already neutralized the most fundamental mechanism through which reality distortion operates. There is a form of professional influence so elegantly constructed, so precisely calibrated to the specific psychological architecture of its target, and so thoroughly disguised within the normal relational dynamics of high-functioning professional environments, that its detection requires not merely general awareness of psychological manipulation, but a specific, technically precise understanding of the mechanism through which emotional experience is converted into strategic leverage, and of the specific professional vulnerabilities that make this conversion possible against targets who would immediately recognize and resist more overt forms of influence.
This form of influence is emotional leverage, the systematic identification and exploitation of emotional needs, attachment patterns, and relational vulnerabilities that every professional carries into their organizational life. With a specific individual across multiple contexts and topics, disagreements that consistently favor the other party's interests and that consistently position the target's interpretation as the less reliable one. The second signal is the progressive accumulation of situations in which the target finds themselves apologizing for, retracting, or qualifying perceptions and judgments that they held with genuine confidence at the time they formed them. The third signal is the development of a specific pattern of pre-communication anxiety, the experience of reviewing one's own perceptions and memories before interacting with a specific individual to verify their accuracy in anticipation of challenge, a cognitive behavior that has no precedent in the target's interactions with other professional counterparts. The mental shielding response to detected reality distortion begins with the establishment of an independent documentary record, the systematic contemporaneous documentation of significant interactions, agreements, and communications that provides an objective reference point whose existence is independent of both the target's memory and the manipulator's retrospective characterization. This documentation does not need to be confrontational or accusatory in its framing. It is most effectively maintained as a routine professional practice of interaction logging that provides the evidentiary foundation for the target's perceptual reliability without signaling to the manipulator that their pattern has been detected and a defensive response has been initiated. Reality distortion loses its power the moment its target stops relying exclusively on their unaided memory as the sole evidence of their own experience. The record is the shield, and the professional who maintains it consistently has already neutralized the most fundamental mechanism through which reality distortion operates. There is a form of professional influence so elegantly constructed, so precisely calibrated to the specific psychological architecture of its target, and so thoroughly disguised within the normal relational dynamics of high-functioning professional environments, that its detection requires not merely general awareness of psychological manipulation, but a specific, technically precise understanding of the mechanism through which emotional experience is converted into strategic leverage, and of the specific professional vulnerabilities that make this conversion possible against targets who would immediately recognize and resist more overt forms of influence. This form of influence is emotional leverage, the systematic identification and exploitation of emotional needs, attachment patterns, and relational vulnerabilities that every professional carries into their organizational life. Their organizational interactions in which their professional identity is reflected back to them with a flattering accuracy that creates a powerful sense of being genuinely seen and valued by someone whose own professional standing makes that recognition particularly meaningful. This experience is not fabricated by the manipulator in the sense of being entirely without authentic basis. The most skilled emotional leverage practitioners are genuine in their idealization phase engagement, investing real attention, real interest, and real relational energy in its construction, because an idealization that the target can sense is performed rather than genuine will not produce the depth of emotional bond that the subsequent conditional withdrawal phase requires to generate its leverage effect. The transition from idealization to conditional withdrawal is rarely dramatic. Dramatic transitions would signal the manipulation too clearly to targets who are not entirely without self-protective awareness. It proceeds instead through a series of subtle modulations in the quality, frequency, and warmth of the relational engagement that the idealization phase established as the baseline. Modulations whose individual instances are each explicable through legitimate professional circumstances, but whose cumulative pattern communicates, below the level of explicit statement, that the continuation of the idealized relational experience is contingent on the target's maintenance of behaviors, positions, and compliance patterns that serve the manipulator's interests. The target who has formed a powerful emotional bond with a relationship that is now sending subtle signals of potential withdrawal does not typically conduct an explicit analytical assessment of whether those signals represent genuine circumstantial factors or deliberate strategic modulation. They experience the anxiety of potential loss and initiate the behaviors that their emotional system has identified as most likely to restore the relational warmth that the withdrawal signals have threatened. Behaviors that the manipulator's conditional withdrawal has been specifically calibrated to elicit. In organizational contexts, the emotional leverage most commonly elicits the behaviors that serve the manipulator's professional interests most directly. The target's support for the manipulator's strategic positions in organizational forums where that support carries weight. The target's compliance with the manipulator's preferred approaches to shared professional responsibilities, the target's willingness to extend the manipulator professional credibility and access that their formal organizational authority alone would not provide, and the target's progressive alignment of their professional identity with the manipulator's characterization of them in ways that increase the target's dependence on the manipulator's validation as the primary source of their professional self-concept. The mental shielding response to emotional leverage begins with the development of what the framework calls emotional needs inventory, an explicit, honest
assessment of the specific emotional needs that one brings into professional relationships, conducted not as a therapeutic exercise in self-exploration, but as a strategic intelligence operation, whose purpose is to map the specific vulnerability profile that a sophisticated emotional leverage practitioner would target. The professional who has conducted this inventory knows which emotional currencies they are most susceptible to: recognition, belonging, mentorship, or genuine understanding, and can apply the heightened vigilance that this knowledge enables to the specific relational dynamics that deploy those currencies with unusual generosity in the early phases of a professional relationship. The second component of the shielding response is the development of what might be called relational source diversification, the deliberate cultivation of multiple independent professional relationships that satisfy each of the emotional needs in the inventory, ensuring that no single professional relationship becomes the primary or exclusive source of any significant emotional needs satisfaction. The professional whose need for recognition is satisfied by multiple independent professional relationships is categorically less susceptible to the conditional withdrawal of recognition as a leverage mechanism than the professional whose primary recognition source is concentrated in a single relationship, whose continuity has been made contingent on compliance. Your emotional needs are not weaknesses, they are human. But in the hands of someone who maps them before you do, they become the architecture of your own captivity. There is a dimension of professional power that is more consequential than positional authority, more durable than financial leverage, and more difficult to detect and counteract than any of the more emotionally visible manipulation patterns that the previous sections have examined. A dimension whose operation is so thoroughly embedded in the normal functioning of legitimate organizational information systems that its manipulation is consistently the last form of exploitation that its targets recognize, long after its effects on their decision quality, their strategic positioning, and their organizational standing have already produced damage that more timely detection could have prevented. This dimension is the control of information, not merely the withholding of specific data points, but the systematic management of the entire informational environment within which the target constructs their understanding of their professional situation, their organizational standing, their competitive landscape, and the reliability of the knowledge on which they base every significant professional decision they make. Information control, in its sophisticated professional manifestation, is not primarily a strategy of deception through false information. It is a strategy of perception management through selective information architecture.
in which what the target knows, what they do not know, what they believe they know, and how they have been led to interpret what they know are all managed with sufficient precision to produce the perceptual framework that serves the manipulator's strategic interests, while maintaining the appearance of normal organizational information dynamics. The foundational mechanism of information control is the exploitation of what information theorists call the knowledge asymmetry, that is, a structural feature of every complex organizational system, the inevitable differential between what different organizational actors know about shared professional situations, based on their different positional access to information sources, their different organizational relationships, and their different involvement in the various processes and decisions that constitute the organization's functioning. In any legitimate organizational context, knowledge asymmetry is a normal and generally manageable feature of organizational life. Different people know different things, and the organizational challenge is to create sufficient information sharing to enable collective action while maintaining the appropriate confidentiality that specific categories of sensitive information require. In the hands of a sophisticated information control practitioner, this normal organizational knowledge asymmetry becomes the raw material for a systematic manipulation of the target's informational environment, one that uses the target's acceptance of normal organizational knowledge differentials as cover for the deliberate management of those differentials in ways that serve the manipulator's strategic interests. The first mechanism is selective disclosure, the deliberate management of which information the target receives, sequenced and framed to produce specific perceptual outcomes that benefit the manipulator. Selective disclosure does not require the communication of false information. It requires only the consistent provision of true information that has been selected, sequenced, and contextualized to produce a picture of the professional situation that is systematically incomplete in ways that the target cannot detect because they do not have access to the information whose absence makes the incompleteness visible. The target who receives accurate information about the challenges facing a specific strategic initiative, but not the information about the political dynamics that are the actual primary determinant of the initiative's prospects, makes a genuinely informed assessment of what they know, and an entirely uninformed assessment of what they do not know, because it has been selectively withheld from them. The second mechanism is framing manipulation, the deliberate management of how information is contextualized, interpreted, and emotionally characterized before
It reaches the target, ensuring that the target's processing of accurate information produces the conclusions the manipulator intends rather than the conclusions the unframed information would support. Framing manipulation is structurally more sophisticated than selective disclosure because it does not require the withholding of any information. It operates entirely through the management of the interpretive context within which accurate information is delivered, exploiting the well-documented psychological finding that the same information processed within different frames produces systematically different conclusions, and that the frame within which information is first encountered has a disproportionate influence on all subsequent processing of that information that is extremely difficult to correct even when the target becomes aware that framing has occurred. The third mechanism is source credibility management, the systematic manipulation of the target's assessment of the reliability and trustworthiness of different information sources in their professional environment to increase the target's dependence on the manipulator as a primary information source while decreasing their confidence in the alternative sources that could provide the independent perspective needed to detect the information control operation. Source credibility management is accomplished through the patient, consistent application of subtle credibility challenges to the information sources the manipulator wants to delegitimize.
not through explicit accusations of unreliability that would be detectable as manipulation, but through the strategic deployment of questions, alternative interpretations, and contextual information that progressively cultivates the target's doubt about specific sources, while simultaneously reinforcing the manipulator's own positioning as the most reliable interpreter of the professional information environment. The mental shielding response to information control begins with the deliberate construction of what the framework calls an independent information architecture, a systematically maintained network of information sources, professional relationships, and knowledge-gathering practices that is explicitly designed to provide informational perspectives that are independent of any single organizational actor's control. This architecture does not require the paranoid assumption that every information source is compromised. It requires only the recognition that informational dependence on any single source creates the vulnerability that information control exploits, and that the deliberate maintenance of source diversity is the foundational protection against that vulnerability. The second component is the development of information provenance tracking, the consistent practice of explicitly noting not merely what information one has received, but where it came from, through which channels it was transmitted, and whose interests its content serves, as a routine cognitive practice that makes the
Patterns of selective disclosure and framing manipulation visible through the effects on the cumulative information landscape, rather than requiring the detection of any individual instance of manipulation that is designed to be undetectable in isolation. The third component is the practice of explicit uncertainty quantification, the disciplined maintenance of explicit awareness of what one does not know as a counterweight to the false sense of informational completeness that selective disclosure produces by filling the target's information environment with accurate but strategically incomplete data. What you know is your map. What you have been prevented from knowing is the territory, and the professional who cannot distinguish between their map and the actual terrain is navigating entirely within a geography that someone else has drawn. There is a manipulation strategy so patient in its execution, so structurally indistinguishable from the legitimate demands of high-performance professional environments, and so precisely targeted at the specific cognitive resources that independent judgment, critical evaluation, and resistance to influence require, that its consistent misattribution by its targets to external environmental pressure rather than deliberate strategic manipulation must be understood not as a failure of intelligence, but as the inevitable consequence of a pattern whose design specifically exploits the professional's commitment to performance under demanding conditions as the primary mechanism of their own cognitive disarmament. This strategy is progressive exhaustion, the systematic deployment of demands, obligations, uncertainties, and interpersonal complexities that individually appear reasonable, professionally justified, and consistent with the normal operating conditions of demanding organizational environments, but that in their cumulative effect produce a progressive depletion of the target's psychological resources that is neither accidental nor incidental to the manipulator's strategy, but is its actual operational objective, because a target whose cognitive, emotional, and volitional resources have been sufficiently depleted is a target whose capacity for the independent judgment and critical evaluation that manipulation detection requires has been correspondingly compromised, leaving them in a state of psychological vulnerability that makes every other manipulation pattern more effective and every shielding response more difficult to execute. The foundational insight that makes progressive exhaustion such a powerful manipulation strategy is the recognition, explicit in the toolkit of sophisticated manipulators and implicit in the research on decision fatigue, ego depletion, and cognitive load, that the psychological resources that independent judgment and critical evaluation require critical evaluation require are finite, depletable, and not fully replenishable within the operational timeframes of demanding professional environments. The prefrontal cortical functions that support the kind of deliberate, critical, System 2 analytical engagement that manipulation detection demands, the capacity to evaluate information against independent standards, to maintain skepticism about conclusions that feel intuitively compelling, to resist the social and emotional pressures that compliance generates, are among the most metabolically expensive cognitive functions the brain performs, and among the first to degrade under conditions of sustained cognitive load, emotional stress, sleep disruption, decision overload, and chronic uncertainty. The manipulator who understands this does not need to defeat the target's critical faculties through the superior quality of their arguments or the irresistibility of their influence techniques. They need only to ensure that the target's critical faculties are sufficiently depleted by the demands of their professional environment, that those faculties are unavailable for the evaluation of the manipulator's influence operations, when those operations are deployed. The operational mechanisms through which progressive exhaustion is deliberately induced in professional contexts are individually identical to the demands that legitimate high-performance organizational environments impose on their members, and this identity is not coincidental. The most sophisticated progressive exhaustion operations are constructed specifically to exploit the target's professional commitment to meeting legitimate organizational demands as the cover under which illegitimate depletion demands are embedded. The exhaustion is produced through three primary channels that operate simultaneously and reinforce each other's depletion effects. The first channel is cognitive overload, the maintenance of a sustained demand on the target's analytical and decision-making resources that consistently exceeds what can be managed within the target's cognitive capacity through the deliberate generation of an unmanageable volume of decisions, analyses, evaluations, and problem-solving demands whose cumulative cognitive load ensures that the target's prefrontal resources are continuously operating at or near their depletion threshold. The second channel is emotional drain, the systematic generation of interpersonal dynamics, relational uncertainties, and emotional demands that consume the target's emotional regulatory resources in ways that leave those resources unavailable for the emotional self-management that effective shielding requires. Emotional drain in organizational contexts is most commonly produced through the deliberate maintenance of relational ambiguity, the sustained uncertainty about the status of significant professional relationships, the manipulator's evaluation of the target's performance, and the security of the target's organizational standing, that generates chronic low-grade anxiety whose continuous emotional processing consumes regulatory resources that are simultaneously needed for the detection of influence. Management of the manipulation operations that the ambiguity is designed to obscure. The third channel is volitional depletion, the systematic erosion of the target's sense of agency, self-efficacy, and confidence in their own judgment through patterns of interaction that consistently produce the experience of inefficacy, regardless of the actual quality of the target's performance. Volitional depletion is the most psychologically precise of the three channels because it targets not merely the cognitive and emotional resources that critical evaluation requires, but the motivational foundation of the self-directed action that shielding responses demand, the confidence that one's own judgment is reliable enough to trust against the social and relational pressure that resisting manipulation consistently generates. The detection of progressive exhaustion as a deliberate manipulation strategy, rather than as the normal consequence of demanding professional environments, requires the development of what the mental shielding framework calls resource tracking, the disciplined, explicit monitoring of one's own psychological resource levels across the three channels that progressive exhaustion deploys, conducted with sufficient regularity and precision to detect the patterns of depletion that deliberate exhaustion produces versus the patterns that legitimate professional demand generates.
The key distinguishing feature of deliberately induced progressive exhaustion is its asymmetry, the consistent pattern in which the demands that produce the most significant resource depletion are concentrated in the domains most relevant to the target's capacity to evaluate and resist the manipulator's influence operations, while the demands in domains unrelated to that capacity are maintained at more manageable levels. The mental shielding response to progressive exhaustion operates through the establishment of what the framework calls cognitive sovereignty protocols, explicit pre-committed practices for the protection and replenishment of the specific psychological resources that independent judgment and manipulation detection require, maintained as non-negotiable professional priorities, regardless of the demand pressure that the exhaustion strategy generates. These protocols include structured cognitive recovery periods that are protected from the demand intrusions that progressive exhaustion deploys, explicit decision load management practices that limit the cumulative decision burden within any given operational period, and deliberate emotional regulation practices that address the anxiety that relational ambiguity produces before it has consumed sufficient regulatory resources to compromise the target's shielding capacity. Exhaustion is not a sign of dedication. In the hands of someone who engineers it, it is the most sophisticated form of disarmament ever deployed against a willing victim.
There is a concept in the professional development discourse that has been so thoroughly misrepresented, so consistently conflated with its dysfunctional counterfeits, and so systematically misapplied in the organizational contexts where its genuine implementation would be most consequential, that its rehabilitation as a precision instrument of cognitive sovereignty requires beginning with a complete dismantling of the misconceptions that have accumulated around it before its actual operational content can be established with sufficient clarity to be practically useful. The concept is psychological boundaries, and the misconceptions that surround it are not minor distortions of an essentially accurate popular understanding, but fundamental inversions of the concept's actual nature, its actual function, and its actual relationship to the professional effectiveness that boundary construction is designed to protect. The most consequential misconception is the identification of psychological boundaries with relational withdrawal, the assumption that the professional who maintains strong psychological boundaries is the professional who maintains emotional distance from their organizational counterparts, who limits their relational investment in professional relationships to the minimum required for functional collaboration, and who treats the maintenance of interpersonal coolness as the primary mechanism of their psychological protection. This misconception is not merely inaccurate. It describes the precise behavioral pattern that sophisticated manipulators most prefer their targets to adopt, because relational withdrawal eliminates the genuine connection and authentic engagement that would provide the independent relational reference points needed to detect and evaluate the manipulator's operations. The genuine concept of psychological boundaries in the mental shielding framework is categorically different from this popular misconception. It is the precise, explicit, consciously maintained definition of the internal cognitive and psychological space within which the professional's autonomous judgment is formed, the values and standards against which professional decisions are evaluated, and the perceptual framework through which professional experience is interpreted, a definition that is maintained with sufficient clarity and consistency to prevent the gradual colonization of that internal space by the manipulator's preferred versions of each of these foundational psychological elements. A psychological boundary is not a wall between the self and others. It is a membrane, a selectively permeable interface that allows genuine relational engagement, authentic emotional connection, and the full participation in professional community that organizational effectiveness requires, while maintaining the integrity of the internal cognitive processes that autonomous professional judgment demands. The professional with strong, Psychological boundaries is not less relationally engaged than their colleagues. They're more precisely engaged because their engagement is conducted from a position of internal clarity that manipulation cannot compromise without their awareness, rather than from the position of internal ambiguity that the absence of boundaries produces. The construction of this boundary architecture begins with what the framework calls the values foundation, the explicit, precisely articulated definition of the core professional values, ethical commitments, and performance standards that constitute the non-negotiable interior of the boundary's protected space. The values foundation is not a list of abstract principles whose content is borrowed from organizational culture documents or professional development frameworks. It is a deeply personal, specifically articulated account of what the professional genuinely cares about, what they are genuinely committed to, and what they would be unwilling to compromise regardless of the social, relational, or organizational pressure that compromise might relieve. This specificity is not optional. The boundary architecture that protects against sophisticated manipulation must be grounded in values whose content is clear enough to generate unambiguous guidance in the specific situations where manipulation pressure is applied, because vague values provide insufficient resistance to the sophisticated reframing operations that manipulators deploy to make boundary violations appear consistent with the values they are actually violating. The second component of boundary construction is what the framework calls the judgment sovereignty protocol, the explicit commitment to maintaining the independent formation of significant professional judgments as an inviolable cognitive process, regardless of the social and relational pressure that independent judgment generates in organizational contexts, where conformity is rewarded and dissent is penalized. Judgment sovereignty does not mean the rejection of input, perspective, and challenge from professional counterparts. Genuine professional judgment is consistently improved by engagement with alternative perspectives that test its conclusions against independent analytical standards. It means the maintenance of the distinction between genuine collaborative reasoning and influence disguised as reasoning. This distinction between genuine collaborative reasoning and influence disguised as reasoning is the most operationally significant boundary the framework establishes, and its consistent maintenance is the most consequential protection against the majority of manipulation operations that professional environments deploy. The third component is the emotional sovereignty protocol, the explicit maintenance of the distinction between emotional responses that arise from the professional's own authentic engagement with their professional experience and emotional responses that have been deliberately induced by the manipulator's deployment of the emotional leverage, reality distortion, and progressive exhaustion operations that the previous sections have documented. Emotional sovereignty does not require the suppression of induced emotions. The emotional experience of manipulation-induced anxiety, confusion, or inadequacy is real regardless of its manipulated origin, and its suppression without recognition would eliminate the signal content that the emotional experience carries about the manipulation operation that produced it. It requires the development of the discriminative awareness that distinguishes between emotions whose content points toward genuine features of the professional's situation and emotions whose content points toward the manipulator's strategic interests, a discrimination that the mindfulness-based awareness practices established in the emotional alchemy framework provide the technical foundation for, and that the mental shielding framework extends into the specific domain of manipulation-induced emotional experience. The fourth component is the behavioral boundary architecture, the explicit, pre-committed definition of the specific behaviors that the professional will and will not engage in, regardless of the relational, social, or organizational pressure that their maintenance generates. Behavioral boundaries are the most externally visible component of the boundary architecture and the component that generates the most immediate and the most intense pressure from manipulation operations that depend on the target's behavioral compliance for their continued effectiveness.
The manipulator whose leverage depends on the target's continued participation in a specific behavioral pattern, the continued provision of organizational support, the continued silence about a specific dynamic, the continued accommodation of demands that serve the manipulator's interests at the target's expense, will deploy their full range of manipulation techniques against the boundary that threatens that participation, making the behavioral boundary the primary test of the boundary architecture's actual structural integrity. There is a specific form of cognitive damage that sustained exposure to sophisticated psychological manipulation produces, damage that is neither immediately visible in the target's explicit reasoning processes nor detectable through the conventional, analytical self-assessment practices that professionals typically deploy to evaluate the quality of their own thinking. It accumulates invisibly, beneath the surface of apparently intact cognitive functioning through the progressive contamination of the perceptual frameworks, evaluative standards, and interpretive processes that constitute the actual architecture of professional decision-making, contaminating them not through the introduction of obviously false beliefs that critical evaluation could identify and reject, but through the subtle, incremental distortion of the foundational assumptions, reference points, and interpretive defaults that shape how information is processed before explicit analytical evaluation begins. This contamination is what the mental shielding framework calls cognitive pollution, and its insidious character derives from the fact that the cognitive processes it has contaminated continue to feel, to the professional operating through them, like the exercise of their own genuine judgment, rather than like the execution of a perceptual and evaluative framework that has been progressively engineered by someone else's strategic interests. The cognitive shield is the systematic architecture of practices, protocols, and awareness disciplines that prevents this contamination from occurring, detects it when it has begun, and reverses it before its accumulation has compromised the professional's decision quality to the point where the decisions made through the contaminated framework have produced irreversible strategic damage. The contamination process operates through 4 primary pathways that target different components of the decision-making architecture simultaneously. The first pathway is reference point corruption, the gradual replacement of the professional's own independently established standards of evaluation with reference points that have been introduced by the manipulator's framing operations and that systematically produce assessments favorable to the manipulator's interests. Reference point corruption is among the most consequential forms of cognitive pollution because it operates at the level of the evaluative baseline that shapes all subsequent comparative judgments. Once the manipulator's preferred reference point has been established as the implicit standard against which outcomes are measured, every assessment the target makes is already compromised before their explicit analytical reasoning has engaged, because the starting point of that reasoning is a reference frame that has been engineered to produce the manipulator's preferred conclusions. The second pathway is vocabulary contamination, the progressive adoption of the manipulator's preferred conceptual vocabulary for describing the professional situation, organizational dynamics, and interpersonal relationships within which the target operates. Vocabulary is not a neutral carrier of pre-existing meanings. It is a cognitive architecture that shapes what can be thought, what distinctions can be made, and what aspects of experience can be brought into conscious awareness for evaluation. The manipulator, whose conceptual vocabulary the target has adopted, has not merely influenced how the target talks about their situation, they have shaped the cognitive categories through which the target perceives, processes, and evaluates their situation, ensuring that the target's apparently independent thinking is conducted within a conceptual framework that produces the perceptual outcomes the manipulator's vocabulary was designed to generate. The third pathway is attention architecture distortion, the systematic manipulation of what the target notices, what they attend to with the focused awareness that produces clear perception, and what falls below the threshold of explicit attention into the background of professional experience, where it shapes behavior through implicit processing without generating the conscious awareness that evaluation requires. Attention architecture distortion is accomplished through the consistent deployment of salience management techniques that make the features of the professional situation that serve the manipulator's interests highly visible to the target's attention, while rendering the features that would support independent assessment of the manipulator's operations relatively invisible. The target, whose attention has been successfully managed in this way, does not experience themselves as missing significant features of their professional environment. They experience themselves as attending to what matters, because the features the manipulator has made salient feel important, and the features they have rendered invisible feel irrelevant. The fourth pathway is confidence calibration manipulation, the systematic distortion of the target's accuracy in assessing the reliability of their own judgments in specific domains, producing either overconfidence in the domains where the manipulator wants the target to act without sufficient critical evaluation, or underconfidence in the domains where the manipulator wants the target to defer to external authority rather than their own independent assessment. Confidence calibration manipulation is the most direct attack on the cognitive sovereignty that the mental shielding framework is designed to protect, because the professional's willingness to trust and act on their own judgment is the foundational prerequisite for every shielding response the framework provides, and the manipulator who successfully undermines that trust has compromised the shielding system's most essential operational element. The cognitive shield addresses all four contamination pathways through a systematic architecture of protective practices whose consistent deployment creates the conditions for decision-making that remains genuinely independent of the manipulation operations targeting it. The first practice is reference point anchoring, the deliberate, explicit establishment and regular reaffirmation of independently derived evaluative standards across the key domains of professional judgment, conducted at sufficient frequency and with sufficient specificity to maintain those standards as the dominant cognitive reference points against which the manipulator's preferred alternatives must compete, rather than the defaults that those alternatives progressively replace through the contamination process. Reference point anchoring is most effectively conducted through the consistent practice of explicit written articulation of one's own evaluative standards, because the act of writing forces the precision of formulation that prevents the vague approximations that manipulation-introduced alternatives can more easily colonize. The second practice is vocabulary sovereignty maintenance, the disciplined practice of periodically examining the conceptual vocabulary through which one is describing and evaluating one's professional situation, explicitly identifying vocabulary elements that have been introduced by external actors, rather than developed through one's own independent reflection, and consciously evaluating whether those vocabulary elements are serving accurate perception or distorted perception in the specific professional context where they are being deployed. The third practice is attention audit, the regular, structured review of what one has been attending to and what one has not been attending to in one's professional environment, conducted with explicit reference to whose interests the current attention distribution serves, and whether a redistribution of attention would reveal features of the professional situation that the current distribution is rendering invisible. The fourth practice is judgment confidence calibration, the disciplined practice of explicitly tracking the accuracy of one's own professional judgments across domains and over time, maintaining an objective record whose evidence base provides a reality-grounded foundation for confidence assessments that is independent of the manipulator's strategic interest in distorting those assessments in either direction. The professional whose confidence is calibrated to an objective record of their actual judgment accuracy cannot be manipulated into either the overconfidence that eliminates critical evaluation or the underconfidence that eliminates independent action, because their confidence is not a psychological state subject to external manipulation, but an empirically grounded assessment subject only to the evidence of their actual performance. Your decisions are only as sovereign as the cognitive architecture through which they are formed, protect the architecture, and the decisions protect themselves. There is a perceptual capability that distinguishes the professionally sovereign individual from every other actor in any complex organizational environment, a capability that is not a natural talent possessed by a fortunate minority, but a developed skill whose technical components can be systematically acquired through the specific training that the mental shielding framework provides, and whose
Possession transforms the professional's relationship to their organizational environment from one of reactive navigation within dynamics they cannot fully see to one of strategic awareness of the complete relational and influence landscape within which every professional interaction they participate in is embedded. This capability is the ability to read the room, not in the colloquial sense of detecting the general emotional tone of a professional gathering, but in the precise, technically sophisticated sense of mapping in real time and with actionable accuracy the manipulation dynamics, power configurations, influence operations, and hidden relational agendas that are operating in any professional environment simultaneously with and beneath the surface of its explicit professional content. The professional who has developed this capability does not merely protect themselves from being the target of manipulation operations they cannot see. They develop the strategic advantage of being the actor in the room who most accurately perceives what is actually happening, as distinct from what appears to be happening, and who can therefore make strategic choices that are calibrated to the actual dynamics of the environment rather than to the managed version of those dynamics that the less perceptive participants are operating within. The technical foundation of room reading capability is the development of what the framework calls multi-level simultaneous processing, the capacity to attend to the content, the relational, and the influence dimensions of a professional interaction simultaneously, extracting independent information streams from each level and synthesizing them into an integrated picture of the interaction's actual dynamics that no single level could provide on its own. Most professionals operating without this framework attend primarily to the content level of professional interactions, the explicit, substantive exchange of information, arguments, proposals, and decisions that constitutes the interaction's ostensible purpose. The content level is the level that professional training prepares them to engage with most effectively, and their focus on it leaves the relational and influence levels largely unmonitored, available to actors who have learned to operate those levels deliberately, while the majority of participants remain unaware of their existence as distinct dimensions of the interaction's actual structure. The relational level contains the information about the actual quality, dynamics, and configuration of the professional relationships between the participants, information that is communicated primarily through nonverbal channels, through the subtle behavioral signals that reveal the actual emotional and relational dynamics operating beneath the professional personas that participants present at the content level. Developing the capacity to read the relational level accurately requires the systematic cultivation of behavioral observation skills that most professional training ignores, the capacity to detect the micro-expressions, postural configurations, vocal quality variations, and spatial positioning patterns. Reveal the actual relational dynamics between participants in ways that their explicit verbal communication is frequently designed to conceal. The professional who can read the relational level accurately knows before any explicit content has been exchanged who respects whom, who fears who is allied with who is competing with whom, and who is managing whom. Information that is foundational to any accurate strategic assessment of the interaction's actual dynamics and of the manipulation operations that may be embedded within them. The influence level contains the information about the deliberate strategic operations that specific participants are deploying to shape the interaction's outcomes in directions that serve their interests, the priming operations that establish the associative context within which subsequent information will be processed, the framing maneuvers that establish the evaluative reference points against which proposals will be assessed,
the social proof deployments that leverage the apparent consensus of respected others to produce compliance from targets whose independent judgment would produce resistance, and the authority signals whose strategic deployment creates the deference asymmetries that give specific actors disproportionate influence over collective decisions. Reading the influence level accurately requires familiarity with the specific behavioral signatures of each influence technique, the characteristic conversational moves, the distinctive topic sequencing patterns, the specific framing constructions, and the particular social dynamic configurations that indicate the deployment of each technique, combined with the real-time attentional capacity to detect these signatures in the compressed, rapidly evolving context of actual professional interactions. The synthesis of information from all three levels, content, relational, and influence, into an integrated picture of the interaction's actual dynamics is the core analytical operation of room reading capability, and its development requires the consistent practice of post-interaction analysis that decomposes completed professional interactions into their three-level structure and explicitly identifies the information that each level contained, how that information related to the information from the other levels, and what the integrated picture reveals about the interaction's actual dynamics that any single level's information alone would have obscured. This post-interaction analysis practice is the primary developmental mechanism for room reading capability. It builds the pattern recognition database that allows real-time multi-level processing to eventually operate with sufficient speed and automaticity to be useful during actual professional interactions, rather than only in retrospective analysis. The specific manipulation signatures that room reading capability is most valuable for detecting are the signatures of the 6 patterns established in the framework's second section, operating in their real-world professional manifestations.
There is a critical juncture in every manipulation detection sequence where the professional who has developed the perceptual capability to identify what is happening must make the most consequential decision that the mental shielding framework requires. The decision of how to respond to detected manipulation in ways that are effective enough to interrupt the manipulation operation, precise enough to protect the professional relationships within which the operation is embedded, sophisticated enough to avoid revealing the full extent of the shielded professional's perceptual capability to the actor whose operations they're addressing, and strategically calibrated to the specific manipulation pattern being responded to, rather than the general category of manipulation that less precise response frameworks address. This decision is consequential because the quality of the response determines not merely whether the immediate manipulation operation is interrupted, but whether the interruption produces the strategic outcomes that the shielded professional actually needs: the cessation of the manipulation, the preservation of their organizational standing, the maintenance of their strategic positioning, and the establishment of the implicit communication that future manipulation attempts will encounter the same resistance without the explicit confrontation that would make that communication a source of relational damage rather than a source of strategic deterrence. The foundational principle of strategic manipulation response is what the framework calls the minimum effective intervention, the practice of deploying the least visible, least confrontational, and least relationally costly response that is sufficient to interrupt the specific manipulation operation being addressed, reserving more explicit and more direct responses for situations where minimum effective interventions have proven insufficient and where the cost of continued manipulation exposure clearly exceeds the cost of the more direct response's relational consequences. This principle is not a prescription for passivity or for the indefinite tolerance of manipulation operations that minimum interventions cannot adequately address. It is a strategic optimization of the response repertoire that preserves the professional's relational capital, organizational standing, and strategic positioning for the situations where those assets are most needed, rather than depleting them through responses that are more confrontational than the specific situation's manipulation dynamics actually require.
The response repertoire for reality distortion begins with documentation deployment, the strategic introduction of the contemporaneous documentary record into interactions where retrospective recharacterization is being deployed, in ways that establish the accurate version of events, without framing the introduction as a direct contradiction of the manipulator's alternative version of events. The professional who responds to a retrospective recharacterization by saying, "According to the notes I made immediately after our last meeting, the agreement we reached was this specific formulation," is not accusing the manipulator of deliberate distortion. They are establishing an evidentiary basis for their own version of events that is independent of the manipulator's characterization and that implicitly communicates the existence of a documentation practice, whose continuation makes the retrospective recharacterization strategy progressively less effective. The second response technique is precision questioning, the deployment of specific, detailed questions about the manipulator's alternative version of events that require the provision of specific, verifiable details that the distorted version cannot generate without the internal inconsistencies that precision questioning is designed to surface. The response repertoire for emotional leverage begins with needs source diversification in action, the visible demonstration through the professional's consistent engagement with multiple relational sources of the emotional currencies that the manipulator's leverage depends on, that the conditional withdrawal of those currencies from the manipulator's relationship does not produce the anxiety of loss that the leverage strategy requires to generate its compliance effect. The professional who visibly draws recognition, belonging, and professional validation from multiple independent sources has not merely reduced their vulnerability to emotional leverage, they have communicated to the manipulator through the behavioral evidence of their diversified relational engagement that the leverage mechanism's foundational prerequisite, the target's exclusive dependence on the manipulator's relationship for a specific emotional currency supply, does not exist in their case. The second response technique is explicit needs articulation, the clear, direct communication of one's emotional needs in professional relationships in ways that make implicit leverage attempts explicit, and therefore available for direct response, rather than operating through the implicit compliance pressure that their unspoken character enables. The response repertoire for information control begins with independent source activation, the visible engagement with information sources that are independent of the manipulator's control, communicated through the professional's explicit reference to those sources in interactions where information control is being deployed. The professional who consistently demonstrates familiarity with information that the information control strategy has withheld from them is communicating, without explicit accusation, that the informational architecture through which the manipulation is operating does not encompass the full range of their informational access, and this communication progressively undermines the informational dependence that the strategy requires. The second response technique is explicit uncertainty acknowledgement, the consistent practice of naming what one does not know in interactions where information control is active, creating the visible record of informational gaps whose existence implicitly questions the completeness of the information environment that the control strategy is managing. The response repertoire for progressive exhaustion begins with strategic demand management, the explicit, visible practice of prioritizing demands according to one's own independently established criteria, rather than according to the urgency hierarchy that the exhaustion strategy has imposed, communicated through the professional's consistent deployment of their own prioritization framework in situations where the exhaustion strategy is generating pressure for a different allocation of cognitive resources. The second response technique is recovery investment signaling, the visible investment of time and resources in the cognitive and emotional recovery practices that maintain the psychological resource levels that independent judgment requires, communicated through the professional's consistent maintenance of these practices even under the demand pressure that the exhaustion strategy generates. The response repertoire for social isolation begins with independent relationship investment, the deliberate, visible cultivation of the professional relationships that the isolation strategy is working to delegitimize, maintained with sufficient consistency and explicitness to communicate that the delegitimization operation is not producing its intended effect on the target's relational engagement. The response to identity erosion begins with values foundation reaffirmation. Consistent, visible alignment of one's professional behavior with the independently established values that constitute the protected interior of the boundary architecture, maintained with sufficient consistency to communicate that the erosion operation has not compromised the foundational values against which the target's professional identity is defined. The most powerful response to manipulation is not the one that defeats the manipulator most completely. It is the one that makes continued manipulation attempts progressively more costly and less effective until the manipulator's strategic calculus concludes that a different target represents a better investment of their operational resources. There is a clinical reality that the mental shielding framework must address with the same technical precision it is applied to every other component of the protection and response architecture. The reality that even the most developed shielding capability cannot provide complete protection against the cognitive contamination effects of sustained, sophisticated manipulation exposure in environments where the manipulation operations are continuous, the manipulator's sophistication is high, and the professional's organizational obligations prevent the complete disengagement from the manipulation environment that full protection would require. The professional who has been operating in a sustained manipulation environment, even one whose shielding practices have significantly reduced the contamination's impact relative to what unshielded exposure would have produced, will accumulate cognitive pollution effects over time that require active, systematic remediation rather than the passive recovery that removal from the manipulation environment alone would provide. This remediation is what the framework calls cognitive recovery, a structured, technically precise process for the systematic identification, assessment, and reversal of the specific cognitive contamination effects that sustained manipulation exposure has produced in the target's perceptual frameworks, evaluative standards, confidence calibration, and decision-making architecture, restoring the full cognitive sovereignty that the contamination has partially compromised. The cognitive recovery process begins with what the framework calls contamination mapping, the systematic, explicit identification of the specific cognitive domains that sustained manipulation exposure has affected, conducted through a structured self-assessment protocol that examines each component of the decision-making architecture against the contamination signatures of the 6 manipulation patterns to which the professional has been exposed. Contamination mapping is not a therapeutic exercise in processing the emotional experience of manipulation. It is a forensic analytical operation whose purpose is to produce a precise inventory of the specific cognitive distortions that the manipulator has introduced, the specific evaluative reference points that have been corrupted, the specific confidence calibrations that have been manipulated, and the specific attentional patterns that have been distorted through the sustained deployment of the manipulator's influence operations. This precision is essential because the cognitive recovery interventions that the protocol prescribes are contamination-specific. They are calibrated to the particular distortions identified in the contamination mapping, rather than to the general category of manipulation exposure that less precise recovery frameworks address. The first contamination domain that mapping typically identifies in sustained manipulation exposure is reference point displacement, the replacement of the professional's independently established evaluative standards with the manipulator's preferred reference points across one or more key domains of professional judgment. The recovery intervention for reference point displacement is what the framework calls standard archaeology, the deliberate excavation and explicit re-articulation of the independently derived evaluative standards that the displaced reference points have replaced, conducted through a structured retrospective process that traces the evolution of the professional's evaluative standards backward through time to the period preceding the manipulation exposure, and explicitly documents the specific ways in which those standards have shifted during the exposure period. This documentation serves two simultaneous functions. It makes the contamination visible as a concrete, specifically located distortion rather than as a vague sense that something has changed in how one evaluates professional situations, and it provides the specific content needed for the reference point restoration that constitutes the recovery intervention's corrective component. The second contamination domain is vocabulary colonization, the adoption of the manipulator's conceptual vocabulary to the point where the professional's internal monologue about their professional situation is being conducted in terms that systematically produce the perceptual outcomes the manipulator's vocabulary was designed to generate. The recovery intervention for vocabulary colonization is conceptual vocabulary audit, the explicit examination of the language through which one is currently describing and evaluating one's professional situation, the identification of vocabulary elements whose origins can be traced to the manipulator's preferred conceptual framework rather than to the professional's own.
Independent reflection and the deliberate replacement of those colonized vocabulary elements with independently developed language whose conceptual content is not preloaded with the manipulator's preferred interpretive conclusions. The third contamination domain is confidence calibration distortion, the systematic over- or underestimation of the reliability of one's own professional judgments in specific domains as a result of the manipulator's strategic manipulation of those calibrations. The recovery intervention for confidence calibration distortion is objective performance record review, the systematic examination of the actual evidence of one's professional judgment quality across the affected domains using contemporaneous documentation rather than retrospectively constructed memory as the evidential basis to produce an empirically grounded recalibration of confidence that is independent of the manipulator's strategic interest in distorting that calibration in either direction. The fourth contamination domain is attentional pattern distortion, the systematic misdirection of the professional's attention toward and away from specific features of their professional environment as a result of the manipulator's sustained salience management operations. The recovery intervention for attentional pattern distortion is deliberate attention redistribution, the structured, explicit reallocation of professional attention toward the features of the professional environment that the manipulation distorted attentional pattern has rendered relatively invisible, conducted through the systematic application of the room reading capability established in the previous section to the professional's own recent history of professional perception, identifying the features that have been consistently below the threshold of explicit attention and deliberately bringing them into the foreground of conscious professional awareness. The cognitive recovery protocol concludes with what the framework calls sovereignty restoration practice, a structured period of deliberate professional decision-making conducted explicitly from the independently established values foundation, with the recovered evaluative standards, the recalibrated confidence levels, and the redistributed attentional patterns that the recovery interventions have restored, in professional contexts that provide the corrective experiences needed to rebuild the professional's trust in their own cognitive sovereignty through the accumulated evidence of its reliable operation.
This restoration practice is not a simulation or a training exercise. It is the deliberate engagement with actual professional decisions in ways that are explicitly anchored to the recovered cognitive architecture, providing the lived professional experience of genuinely independent judgment that rebuilds the embodied confidence in cognitive sovereignty that sustained manipulation exposure has progressively eroded. Recovery is not the return to who you were before the exposure. It is the emergence of who you are when the contamination has been cleared. And that professional is more capable, more precise, and more genuinely sovereign than the one who entered the manipulation environment without knowing what they were entering. There is no professional context in which the complete mental shielding system faces a more concentrated, more sophisticated, and more consequential test of its operational integrity than the high-stakes negotiation, the context in which every manipulation pattern the framework has documented is potentially in simultaneous deployment by a counterpart whose primary strategic objective may be precisely the compromise of the target negotiator's cognitive sovereignty, whose deployment of those patterns is calibrated to the specific vulnerability profile that their preparation has identified in their counterpart, and whose success in achieving that compromise translates directly into financial, strategic, and positional outcomes whose magnitude makes the investment in sophisticated psychological operations entirely rational from the manipulator's strategic perspective. The high-stakes negotiation is not merely one of many professional contexts where mental shielding capability is valuable. It is the crucible in which the framework's complete architecture is simultaneously tested across every dimension it has established, and where the quality of that architecture's integration determines whether the negotiator operates from a position of genuine cognitive sovereignty or from the position of a compromised decision-maker whose apparent strategic sophistication is being systematically exploited by a counterpart who has done the work of understanding their psychological architecture more thoroughly than they have done themselves. The pre-negotiation phase of mental shielding deployment begins with what the framework calls the sovereignty audit, a structured self-assessment protocol conducted in the period immediately preceding the negotiation that explicitly examines the current integrity of each component of the cognitive shielding architecture across the specific vulnerability domains that the anticipated negotiation context is most likely to target. The sovereignty audit is not a general psychological preparation exercise. It is a targeted forensic examination of the specific cognitive and emotional conditions that the negotiator is bringing into the interaction, assessed against the specific manipulation operations that the counterpart's profile and the negotiation's structural characteristics suggest are most likely to be deployed. The audit examines the current integrity of the evaluative reference points that the negotiation's anchoring dynamics will target, the current calibration of the emotional needs that the counterpart's emotional leverage operations may exploit, the current quality of the attentional architecture that the counterpart's salience management will attempt to distort, and the current level of the cognitive resources that progressive exhaustion tactics will work to deplete throughout the negotiation's duration. The real-time shielding architecture that the sovereignty audit activates for deployment throughout the negotiation operates through 3 simultaneous processing streams that correspond to the 3 levels of room reading capability established in the previous sections. The content stream maintains the analytical engagement with the negotiation's substantive dimensions that produces the strategic and tactical intelligence that effective negotiation requires. The relational stream maintains the continuous monitoring of the counterpart's behavioral signals at the nonverbal level, tracking the micro-expressions, postural configurations, and vocal quality variations that reveal the actual emotional and strategic dynamics operating beneath the counterpart's professional presentation. The influence stream maintains the explicit monitoring of the manipulation operation signatures that the framework has established as the behavioral indicators of each of the 6 patterns, tracking the conversational moves, framing constructions, and social dynamic configurations that indicate the deployment of specific influence techniques in real time. The most critical real-time shielding challenge in high-stakes negotiation is the management of the specific cognitive state that sophisticated negotiating pressure is designed to produce, the state of compressed decision bandwidth in which the negotiator's System 2 analytical resources have been sufficiently depleted by the negotiation's cognitive, emotional, and temporal demands that their decision-making is increasingly governed by System 1's automatic, heuristic-driven processing rather than by the deliberate, critical analytical engagement that genuine cognitive sovereignty requires. The mental shielding response to this state is what the framework calls cognitive sovereignty maintenance under pressure, a set of pre-committed practices that preserve sufficient System 2 engagement for the shielding architecture's continued operation, even as the negotiation's pressure dynamics are working systematically to compress the cognitive bandwidth that engagement requires. The first practice is strategic pausing, the deliberate, pre-committed use of the physical and temporal space of negotiation breaks, whether naturally occurring or strategically requested, to conduct rapid versions of the sovereignty audit's key components and restore the cognitive resource levels that sustained negotiation pressure has been depleting. The second practice is anchor resistance protocol, explicit, pre-committed practice of generating independent value assessments for every significant numerical proposal encountered in the negotiation before the counterpart's anchor has had sufficient processing time to establish itself as the cognitive reference point that all subsequent assessments will be made relative to. The third practice is emotional signal monitoring, the continuous, explicit tracking of the emotional states that the negotiation is generating, assessed in real time against the framework's discrimination between genuine strategic signal emotions and manipulation-induced schema activations, ensuring that the behavioral responses the negotiation elicits are calibrated to the actual strategic situation, rather than to the manipulator's preferred emotional frame. The post-negotiation contamination audit examines each component of the cognitive shielding architecture for the specific distortion signatures that the negotiation's manipulation operations may have introduced, applying the cognitive recovery protocol's interventions to any contamination effects detected before they have had sufficient time to consolidate into the more deeply embedded cognitive pollution that extended recovery interventions are required to address. The negotiator who deploys the complete mental shielding architecture across all 3 phases of the negotiation cycle is not negotiating defensively. They are negotiating from the most genuinely offensive position available in any high-stakes professional exchange, because the cognitive sovereignty their shielding maintains gives them access to a more accurate picture of the negotiation's actual dynamics than any counterpart whose shielding is less developed can perceive. And that perceptual advantage is the most consequential strategic asset any negotiator can bring to the table. The shield does not make you cautious, it makes you free, and a free mind at a negotiating table is the most formidable force in the room. There is a transformation that occurs at a specific threshold of mental shielding development, a threshold that is not reached through the mastery of any single component of the framework, but through the integration of all components into a coherent, mutually reinforcing operational system, whose collective functioning produces a quality of cognitive sovereignty that is categorically different from the sum of its individual parts. Before this threshold, the mental shielding practices are experienced as deliberate, effortful interventions that must be consciously deployed against manipulation operations that have already achieved some degree of penetration, responses to influence attempts that are detected after they have begun, rather than before they have established their initial foothold in the target's perceptual and evaluative architecture. After this threshold, the shielding system operates with a different quality entirely, not as a reactive defense against detected manipulation, but as a proactive cognitive environment whose integrity is maintained continuously and automatically, making the initial penetration that reactive shielding responds to progressively more difficult to achieve, because the cognitive conditions that manipulation operations require for their effectiveness are systematically absent from the shielded professional's operating environment. This transformation represents the achievement of what the framework calls permanent shielding architecture, a cognitive infrastructure whose maintenance does not depend on the continuous conscious deployment of explicit shielding practices, but whose integrity is built into the fundamental operating conditions of the professional's cognitive and relational engagement with their environment. The permanent shielding architecture is not the end state of a developmental process that is then complete. It is the beginning of a qualitatively different relationship with professional environments, one that requires ongoing maintenance and ongoing development, but that operates from a foundational integrity that reactive shielding cannot provide. Understanding the architecture of this permanent system, the specific structural features whose integration produces its qualitatively different protective capacity, is the final analytical task of the mental shielding framework before its complete integration into the professional's ongoing practice. The first structural feature of the permanent shielding architecture is values crystallization, the development of a values foundation whose clarity, specificity, and depth of integration into the professional's cognitive and behavioral functioning has reached the point where it operates not as a set of consciously recalled principles that must be deliberately applied to specific situations, but as the automatic evaluative baseline from which all professional experience is processed. Values crystallization does not occur through the initial articulation of the values foundation that the framework's boundary construction methodology prescribes. It occurs through the sustained practice of explicit, values-aligned decision-making over sufficient time and across sufficient professional contexts that the values become
embedded in the professional's automatic processing architecture at a level that makes values inconsistent behavior cognitively uncomfortable in the same immediate, pre-reflective way that physical pain is uncomfortable, as a signal that something is wrong, that is generated before conscious evaluation has determined what is wrong or why. The professional whose values have crystallized to this level cannot be gradually manipulated into values-inconsistent behavior through the incremental compliance escalation that sophisticated manipulation operations deploy, because each incremental step produces the immediate discomfort signal that crystallized values generate, making the accumulation of incremental compliance that escalation requires impossible without the professional's conscious awareness. The second structural feature is perceptual sovereignty consolidation, the development of the professional's multi-level simultaneous processing capability established in the room reading section, to the point where it operates as the professional's default perceptual engagement with professional environments rather than as a deliberately activated analytical overlay. The professional whose perceptual sovereignty has been consolidated to this level does not conduct room reading as a separate cognitive task performed in addition to their engagement with the professional content of their environment. They perceive professional environments simultaneously at the content, relational, and influence levels as their natural default mode of professional perception, in the same way that an expert chess player perceives the board simultaneously at the piece, tactical, and strategic levels rather than sequentially analyzing each level as a separate cognitive operation.
This consolidated perceptual capability means that manipulation operations encounter a perceptual system that is continuously monitoring the influence level of every professional interaction as a baseline feature of the professional's engagement with their environment, making the early detection that reactive shielding can only achieve through deliberate deployment available as an automatic feature of the consolidated perceiver's ordinary professional awareness. The third structural feature is relational architecture integrity, the development of the professional's relational environment to the point where its structural configuration provides ongoing, automatic protection against the social isolation and identity erosion patterns that the most damaging sustained manipulation operations depend on. Relational architecture integrity is achieved through the deliberate construction and maintenance of a professional relationship network that is explicitly designed to provide multiple independent sources of reality verification, values affirmation, capability recognition, and strategic perspective. A network whose structural diversity makes the delegitimization and isolation operations that sophisticated manipulators deploy against independent relational sources progressively less effective because the target's relational foundation is sufficiently loose. Distributed that the loss or compromise of any single relationship leaves the network's protective functions substantially intact. The integration of these three structural features, values crystallization, perceptual sovereignty consolidation, and relational architecture integrity, into a unified operational system, produces the permanent shielding architecture, whose qualitative difference from reactively shielded derives from its proactive character. The reactively shielded professional is protected against manipulation operations that they detect, and is vulnerable to the operations they do not detect quickly enough. The professional whose permanent architecture is fully integrated is protected against manipulation operations at the level of the cognitive conditions that those operations require, because the conditions, the perceptual gaps, the values ambiguities, the relational dependencies, the cognitive resource vulnerabilities that manipulation depends on for its effectiveness are systematically addressed by the architecture's ongoing operation, rather than by reactive responses to detected intrusions. The permanent shielding architecture is not a fortress in the sense of an impermeable barrier between the professional and their organizational environment. It is a fortress in the sense of a secure base, a cognitive and relational foundation of sufficient integrity that the professional can engage with their organizational environment, including its most sophisticated manipulation operations, from a position of genuine security rather than from the position of a target managing their exposure to forces they cannot fully control. From this secure base, the professional does not merely protect themselves from manipulation. They develop the capacity to engage with the full complexity of their professional environment, including its most challenging relational and influence dynamics, with the confidence, clarity, and strategic precision that genuine cognitive sovereignty makes possible. The shield is not what protects you from the world. It is what allows you to engage with the world fully, knowing that what you bring to that engagement is genuinely, permanently, irreducibly your own. There is a final understanding that the complete engagement with the art of mental shielding makes available, an understanding that transcends the specific detection techniques, the pattern maps, the response repertoires, and the recovery protocols that the preceding sections have established, and that addresses something more fundamental than any of them individually or collectively. It is the understanding of what cognitive sovereignty actually means as a lived professional reality, not as a defensive posture adopted in response to the presence of manipulation in one's environment, not as a temporary state achieved through the successful deployment of shielding practices in a specific high-stakes situation, but as the permanent, foundational quality of one's relationship to every professional environment one inhabits, every decision one makes, every relationship one enters, and every strategic choice one executes. This understanding does not arrive as a conclusion of the intellectual engagement with the framework's components. It arrives as a direct experience of the qualitative difference between professional life conducted from the compromised cognitive foundation that unshielded manipulation exposure produces, and professional life conducted from the genuine cognitive sovereignty that the permanent shielding architecture makes possible. And that experiential understanding carries with it a responsibility that the framework's final section must address directly: the responsibility of knowing what genuine cognitive freedom is, what it costs to maintain, and what it demands of the professional who has achieved it in environments where that freedom is systematically under assault. The first dimension of this responsibility is the ongoing maintenance commitment that the permanent shielding architecture requires. The recognition that the integration threshold, whose achievement transforms reactive shielding into proactive cognitive sovereignty, does not represent the end of the developmental work that the framework demands, but the beginning of a qualitatively different relationship with that work. The permanent architecture requires ongoing maintenance not because its structural features are fragile or easily disrupted, but because the professional environments within which it operates are continuously evolving, and the manipulation operations those environments generate are continuously adapting to the defensive patterns they encounter. The sophisticated manipulator who encounters consistent shielding resistance does not abandon their operational objectives. They adapt their methodology, developing more sophisticated approaches that target the specific features of the shielding architecture they have identified as its boundaries. The maintenance commitment is the ongoing development of the shielding architecture's sophistication in response to the evolving sophistication of the manipulation operations it must protect against. A developmental commitment that does not terminate at any fixed point, but that compounds its protective capacity with every cycle of adaptation and refinement that the ongoing professional engagement with manipulation environments produces. The second dimension of the responsibility is what might be called the sovereignty transmission obligation. The recognition that the cognitive freedom that the permanent shielding architecture makes possible is not merely a personal
professional asset, but a capability whose transmission to the professional environments and communities within which one operates constitutes one of the most consequential contributions that a mentally shielded professional can make to the collective cognitive health of those environments. Every organization, every professional community, and every collaborative network that contains a sufficient density of mentally shielded professionals is a more cognitively healthy environment for all of its members, not merely because the shielded professionals are protected against manipulation, but because their presence, their modeling of cognitive sovereignty, and their active resistance to manipulation operations raises the cognitive health baseline of the entire environment by making manipulation less effective, less rewarded, and less systematically deployed within it. The professionally sovereign individual who operates in isolation, who uses their shielding capability exclusively for personal protection without engaging its transmissive potential, is operating at a fraction of the framework's actual capacity for positive professional impact. The third dimension of the responsibility is the ethical commitment that genuine cognitive sovereignty places on its possessor. The commitment to the scrupulous non-deployment of the deep understanding of manipulation mechanisms that the framework provides for the manipulation of others, rather than further protection. The professional who has developed the complete mental shielding architecture possesses a detailed, technically precise understanding of exactly how psychological manipulation operates, which vulnerabilities it exploits, and which techniques are most effective against which target profiles, an understanding whose possession creates the capacity to deploy those techniques with a sophistication and a precision that the professional's pre-framework understanding did not make available. The ethical commitment of the mentally shielded professional is the unambiguous, unconditional dedication of this understanding exclusively to protection, to the detection and interruption of manipulation operations, to the development of shielding capability in themselves and others, and to the creation of professional environments where cognitive sovereignty is the norm rather than the exception, and never to the exploitation of others' vulnerabilities for personal strategic advantage, regardless of the competitive pressure, the organizational incentive structure, or the short-term strategic gains that such exploitation might produce. The sovereign mind is not the invulnerable mind. It is the mind that has done the work of understanding its own vulnerabilities with sufficient precision to protect them, that has built the architecture of values, perception, and relationship that makes genuine autonomous judgment possible in environments specifically designed to compromise it, and that carries that architecture forward not as a burden of perpetual vigilance, but as the natural operating condition of a professional who has claimed the cognitive freedom that is every serious professional's most fundamental right and most consequential responsibility. What you protect when you protect your mind is not merely your professional performance or your strategic outcomes. It is the integrity of the cognitive process through which every value you hold, every commitment you make, and every contribution you offer to the professional communities you inhabit is formed, evaluated, and acted upon. That process is the origin of everything genuinely yours in your professional life. Protect it as such, with the full force of everything this framework has established, maintained with the full consistency of a permanent commitment, and offered in its protected form to every professional environment that your sovereign presence has the power to make more cognitively free. Your mind is the only territory that is entirely yours. Govern it accordingly.